It was a cold autumn evening in 1997 when the peaceful, close-knit neighborhood of Maplewood was rocked by the sudden disappearance of Ruth and her 10-year-old granddaughter, Lily. Ruth, a 65-year-old retired schoolteacher, was well known and loved in the community. She had raised Lily after the tragic death of her parents in a car accident, becoming not just a guardian, but a nurturing, guiding presence in Lily's life. Their bond was unbreakable, and together they created a warm home filled with laughter and the comforting routine of everyday life. On that particular evening, Ruth and Lily were supposed to enjoy their usual night together, watching their favorite television shows, reading books, and preparing for the upcoming school day. The evening was quiet, a typical fall night in their cozy home. Ruth had made hot cocoa for herself and Lily, and the two of them had settled in front of the television, as they often did. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Yet, when the first light of morning broke through the windows, everything changed. Ruth's neighbors, who often checked in on her and Lily, grew concerned when they found the house eerily silent. They knocked on the door but received no answer. The house, though, was locked from the inside, and when they looked through the windows, there was no sign of life. It was as if the house had been abandoned in the dead of night. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, and nothing appeared out of place. The only thing missing was Ruth and Lily. Panic quickly spread as neighbors began talking, and the family was alerted. Local authorities arrived within hours, launching a search for the two. The police combed the streets, the nearby woods, and even questioned everyone who lived close by. But there were no signs of Ruth or Lily. No one had heard anything unusual, and no one had seen the two leave the house. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The questions began to swirl. Had they been kidnapped? Did Ruth and Lily leave on their own? Or was there something more sinister at play? The case quickly became a haunting mystery for the town of Maplewood. With no evidence, no witnesses, and no leads, the search grew more desperate. But eventually, the case turned cold. Months turned into years, and still, there was no sign of Ruth and Lily. The unanswered questions and the strange disappearance weighed heavily on the town, but time, as it often does, pushed the case further into the shadows. The haunting question remained: what had happened to Ruth and Lily? No one knew, and for 27 long years, no answers came. The investigation into the disappearance of Ruth and Lily was thorough and exhaustive. Local police worked tirelessly, questioning anyone they could think of who might have had any information. They canvassed the neighborhood, spoke to neighbors, friends, and family members, and even went so far as to investigate Ruth's past, hoping that something might come to light. They spoke with former acquaintances, distant relatives, and anyone else who might have had a connection to Ruth or Lily, but all their efforts seemed to lead to dead ends. Even the most meticulous searches of nearby forests, roads, and abandoned areas turned up nothing. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of forced entry into the house, and no sign that anyone had left voluntarily. It was as if Ruth and Lily had simply vanished into thin air. The police considered every possible angle. They looked into the possibility that Ruth had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong, or that there had been an altercation that led to the disappearance. They even explored the possibility that Ruth and Lily had run away, although that seemed highly unlikely. Ruth was well established in the community, known for her role as a teacher and pillar of the neighborhood. Lily was a bright, promising student with no history of rebellious behavior. The idea that they would both suddenly abandon their lives made no sense. Over time, the frustration grew, and the mystery deepened. Ruth's children, who had lived out of town, continued to push for answers, and Lily's extended family did the same. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, the family would come together, holding out hope that this year would be the year they found some kind of resolution. The sadness of not knowing what happened was compounded by the growing fear that the answer might never come. As the years passed, the initial hope of finding Ruth and Lily alive slowly began to fade. Some people in town started to wonder whether Ruth and Lily had simply run away to escape their small town life. It was a theory that seemed more plausible as time went on, but it didn't hold water. Ruth had always been deeply rooted in her community, and Lily had a future ahead of her. Neither of them seemed the type to walk away from everything they knew. Still, without any new clues or leads, the case grew colder. Despite the mounting frustration, the police refused to let the case go. Cold case detectives took over, sifting through old files, re-interviewing witnesses, and following up on every small detail that might have been overlooked. But the years dragged on, and the case remained unsolved. Without any new evidence or credible leads, it seemed as if Ruth and Lily's disappearance would remain a haunting mystery. In 2024, after nearly 3 decades of unanswered questions and frustration, the case of Ruth and Lily's disappearance was unexpectedly reopened. New tips had emerged, though they were vague and cryptic at best. Strange, anonymous phone calls and mysterious messages came through, each one seeming to offer little more than tantalizing fragments of information. They led nowhere, but they reignited a flicker of hope that anything might break the silence. Determined to find closure, the police decided to revisit Ruth and Lily's old neighborhood, carefully retracing their steps in the hope of uncovering something that had been missed all those years ago. This time, as part of a routine examination of the area, authorities decided to search Ruth's home once again. The house had been sold after her disappearance, and the new owners were in the process of renovating the old family home. Despite the thorough investigation conducted decades earlier, something in the back of the police officers' minds told them that a fresh set of eyes might reveal something they had overlooked while inspecting the basement. One of the detectives noticed something odd. The floorboards seemed uneven, and the ground beneath appeared unusually disturbed. A sense of unease crept over the detective as they knelt down, brushing away layers of dust and debris. What they uncovered was both strange and unsettling. A series of objects wrapped tightly in plastic and buried beneath the dirt. At first, the workers who had been helping with the renovation assumed it was just debris or old trash left behind by previous tenants. But as they unearthed the items carefully, they realized it was something far more significant. The police were called in immediately. The moment they arrived, they could sense that this was no ordinary discovery. What they unearthed beneath the floorboards was astonishing. Hidden among the dirt were several personal belongings that belonged to Ruth and Lily. Jewelry, photographs, and clothing items that could only have belonged to the missing pair. The items were carefully concealed in the ground, as if someone had gone to great lengths to hide them. There was no sign of Ruth or Lily, but these artifacts were a clear and heartbreaking clue that could finally lead to the answers that had eluded everyone for so long. For the authorities, this discovery marked a major breakthrough. The items were a grim reminder of what had transpired in the years before, but they also held the potential to crack open the mystery that had haunted the town for decades. Hidden beneath the floorboards of Ruth and Lily's home, buried so carefully, were pieces of a puzzle that could finally bring the truth to light. As forensic teams carefully analyzed the items found buried beneath the floorboards of Ruth and Lily's home, they made a discovery that sent a ripple through the investigation, something far more disturbing than the personal belongings they had already uncovered. Among the items was a hidden journal written by Ruth herself. It appeared that Ruth had kept this journal in secret, perhaps in an attempt to document events that she knew could one day provide answers. The journal detailed a growing sense of unease that Ruth had felt in the months leading up to her disappearance. In her handwriting, the authorities found entries describing strange occurrences, a persistent feeling that someone was watching her, odd noises late at night, and encounters with unfamiliar people, strangers who had come to her door without warning. Ruth's words painted a picture of a woman growing increasingly alarmed and confused by the mysterious events unfolding around her. As the entries progressed, they became more unsettling. Ruth wrote about a sense of impending danger, a feeling that something terrible was about to happen, and a promise she had made to someone to keep quiet about what she had discovered. It was clear from her journal that Ruth had known something was wrong. She had been trying to protect Lily, but it seemed that her efforts had been in vain. The journal described an incident, a confrontation with someone Ruth referred to only as him. It was evident that Ruth had become aware of something far darker than anyone had anticipated. Perhaps she had uncovered a criminal operation that was being run right under her nose. This new lead in the case opened up several avenues of investigation. The police began to track down the people Ruth had mentioned in her journal. One name kept appearing: a man who had once been a trusted member of the community, someone who had been close to. This new lead in the case opened up several avenues of investigation. The police began to track down the people Ruth had mentioned in her journal. One name kept appearing: a man who had once been a trusted member of the community, someone who had been close to Ruth. He was known to be a friend of the family, but as the investigation continued, a much darker side of his past began to emerge. The man had a criminal record, one that had been conveniently overlooked at the time of Ruth and Lily's disappearance. Further digging revealed that this man had been involved in a much larger criminal operation, one that had been operating in the shadows of Maplewood for years. Ruth and Lily, unbeknownst to them, had inadvertently gotten caught in the crossfire. The man had played a significant role in the operation, and Ruth had either stumbled upon something she wasn't meant to know or had been a target all along. The chilling truth began to surface: their abduction wasn't a random event. It had been orchestrated through a combination of forensic evidence and witness testimony. The authorities were eventually able to track down the man. He had been living under a different identity for years, hiding from the law and using the secrecy of his new life to avoid detection. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed to the abduction of Ruth and Lily. His motives were still unclear, but it became evident that Ruth had known too much about the illegal activities he had been involved in. Lily, too, had become a pawn in a much larger game. The man had used her as leverage to keep Ruth silent, hiding the two women away in a remote cabin outside the city. His plan had been to keep them out of sight, to prevent Ruth from exposing what she had discovered. The confession was a revelation, but it also raised even more questions. What exactly had Ruth uncovered? What was the scope of the criminal operation that had ensnared her and her granddaughter? As the authorities delved deeper into the man's past, they uncovered a tangled web of deceit, corruption, and crime that had been hidden from the public for years. While Ruth and Lily's tragic fate had finally been explained, the story was far from over. The investigation now turned to uncovering the full extent of the criminal network and ensuring that the perpetrators would face justice. Ruth and Lily's ordeal had been unimaginable, but at least now, the truth had been revealed, and the pieces of their story were finally falling into place. The truth about Ruth and Lily's disappearance had been uncovered, but it came at a devastating cost. After decades of unanswered questions and unspeakable grief, the families finally had the closure they had so desperately longed for. The man responsible for their abduction had been arrested, and the case was brought to court. The details of Ruth and Lily's confinement were horrifying, and as the truth unfolded in the courtroom, it became clear that their lives had been stolen in the most tragic of ways. The abductor's confession and the investigation into the criminal operation revealed the extent of the trauma Ruth and Lily had endured. For years, they had been hidden away in a remote cabin, isolated from the world, their lives controlled by a man whose motives were clouded in secrecy. Ruth had tried to protect Lily to the best of her ability, but in the end, their abduction was part of a much larger scheme that had been operating for far too long, unnoticed by the authorities. The long years of fear, isolation, and uncertainty were now laid bare for all to see. The court proceedings were emotional and gut-wrenching for the family. Ruth's children, Lily's cousins, and close friends sat in the courtroom, fighting to hold back tears as they listened to the details of what had happened to their loved ones. The pain of knowing what Ruth and Lily had been through during those last years was almost too much to bear. But despite the devastation, the trial also provided a sense of justice. The man responsible for their suffering was now facing the consequences of his actions. Though the legal system had provided the family with some measure of justice, the years of agony and uncertainty would never fully be undone. The emotional scars left by Ruth and Lily's disappearance were deep, and the grief of losing them for so long was impossible to erase. Their lives had been stolen, and the family had been left to pick up the pieces of a life interrupted. But at least now, they knew the truth. The unanswered questions that had haunted them for decades had been answered, and the mystery had been solved. The families could finally begin the difficult process of healing. They could remember Ruth and Lily not as missing persons, but as beloved family members who had been taken too soon. The pain of the last years would never disappear, but the knowledge that the truth had come to light allowed them to move forward. Ruth and Lily had finally received the justice they deserved, and the families could hold on to the memories of happier times, knowing that their loved ones had not been forgotten.